I'm so excited to be moderating this panel with women who I actually know. Know how awesome all of you are and all of the amazing things you're doing. And I just feel very grateful to be able to do that. So let's get started.
All right.
To kick things off for everyone watching who doesn't know who I am, I'm Jenny Kaplan. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Wonder Media Network, which is an audio-first media company. We make podcasts. And our mission is to amplify underrepresented voices. We make podcasts, both Wonder Media Network branded podcasts and also podcasts for other organizations to help with their internal and external comms. So talking about women in audio is a near and dear subject for me. It's what I spend all my time doing. So I'm very excited. And instead of me introducing each of you, which I would love to do, I'm just going to let each of you introduce yourself. So Janine, do you want to start us off?
Sure, happy to. So my name is Janine Wright. I am the COO and CLO of Simplecast. Simplecast is a podcasting technologies company. We provide the audio infrastructure, distribution, analytics, and monetization tools for podcasters.
My favorite other podcasting company.
Thank you.
Hosting platform. We're very loyal Simplecast users, I must say. Ashanti, would you like to go next?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Ashanti Golar. I am the founder of the Brown Girls Guide to Politics, which is the one-stop shop for women of color who are interested in politics. We have a blog, and we also have a podcast on Wonder Media Network. That's how I first met Jenny, when she emailed me out of the blue when they were doing Women Belong in the House and asked me if I would appear on an episode, which ended up being me appearing on several episodes, and then as the joining forces to turn the BGG into a podcast. And I also serve as the national president of Emerge, and we focus on recruiting and training women to run for office.
Amazing. Thank you. Yes. What went from one interview for one segment of one episode of Women Belong in the House turned into Ashanti basically being on every episode and then launching her own show, which is ideal. And we're now in season 3, which is amazing. Heba, tell us about yourself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Heba Fisher. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a company called Kerning Cultures. We're a podcast network based in Dubai. I'm currently in Seattle, but that's a different story. And we have 7 shows under our network, 5 in Arabic and 2 in English. And our shows regularly top the podcast charts across the Middle East.
Amazing. And I don't remember how we first met, but it's been lovely. We've had some chats where we get to talk about all of the joys and not joys of running podcasting companies, which is lovely to have someone else to talk that through with. Okay, so the way we're going to sort of do this panel, I have a bunch of questions, but I'm hoping that this will be more of a conversation. And for everyone who's attending, if you have any questions, put them in the chat. And we, depending on how the conversation is flowing, we may ask them throughout, or I'll definitely save some time at the end. So please feel free to put questions in the chat, and I will get to as many as we possibly can. I wanted to start with some specific questions. So Heba, I'm particularly interested in your international perspective. How have you learned from how audio is used in other cultures around the world, and how does audio compare with other kinds of media? What's that been like to work abroad and have also a US sense?
Yeah, so for context, we've been producing stories for the past 5 years with Kerning Cultures, and the podcast industry in the Middle East is very much in its early stages. I think it's actually, if I can place it time-wise, it's where the US podcast industry was 5 years ago, is where it is today. So we're just at the beginning of the wave. And so when we started producing episodes, I mean, we would start conversations asking for interviews, saying, do you know what a podcast is? Like, can we have, some moments of your time to record? And what we found was that actually we had a lot more access to stories because we were audio only, as opposed to having, a video camera stuck in your face. And so we were able to go places. And of course, you're able to also keep people anonymous a lot more easily with audio than you can with things like video. And so that's been really wonderful. I mean, one of the things that we're so proud of, I guess, with what we're doing with podcasting in the region is that we have a long history of the oral tradition in the Arab world, and this tradition of gathering around what are called hekawati, these oral storytellers who would tell these long form stories in the streets. And you would sit around and they would, these beautiful stories that would go on for an hour and more. And the orator would narrate the different voices, and that as a tradition has kind of died off, I would say, with modern times. And so a lot of what we're doing with podcasting is sort of a digital revival of that oral tradition, which is really beautiful, and I think resonates very much with listeners and with the growing audiences.
I really feel one of the reasons I love audio so much is that I feel like storytelling, and particularly audio storytelling, is how we connect as human beings. It's how we build empathy. And I think that goes back to why those sort of communal storytellers were so powerful and important. And that's really cool to hear that, being part of the modern digital era in this way, which is great. Another field where storytelling is vital is politics. So Ashanti, I want to hear a little bit from you. Especially right now, like being in politics at the moment looks different, I think, than at any other time in history. So how do you think politicians should use podcasts, or activists should use podcasts? And how are you using digital mediums like audio and podcasting differently to help train or activate campaigns, perhaps, than you were before?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we had to look at Emerge when, we entered this pandemic is everything that we do is in person. So it was immediately, you see overnight, everything that you stand for, your branding is like turned upside down. But we also saw the entire world of campaigning turn upside down. But we also knew that there was opportunity here, particularly to elevate the stories of women, because what you saw was it was the women leaders at the state and local level who were immediately doing the best work to protect their citizens, to protect their community. So we immediately shifted at Emerge to talking about leaders matter. This is why you need women in leadership, because it is Mayor London Breed who was the first mayor to issue a warning to do shelter in place before all of the other mayors, along with Libby Schaaf, the mayor of Oakland. And we knew we had to amplify this work. So much of our work at Emerge has been talking about the stories of these women. We implemented a virtual salon series where we're bringing each of them on to talk about being a woman leader during this time and all of the differences that you even have. Right now we're saying how great Mayor Breed and how great Mayor Schaaf are, but when they initially did all of their work, they got heavily criticized. People were saying they were overreacting, they were being too prepared, and those are the things that we hear about women leaders all the time. But we also know that during these times as a leader, you're either going to sink or swim, and we're seeing the women swim. So making sure that we are highlighting all of those stories. And when we were starting season 3 of the podcast, it was also pre-COVID. But one of the things that we've been able to do is to also use the podcast to highlight how women activists are leading during this time. We teamed up with She the People, which is an organization that is building a home for 1 million women of color. They had their 20 women of color to watch in 2020. So we're interviewing them this season, and it did shift the conversation a lot. We had to talk about, okay, with Catherine Quinton, who works with a Student Vote Coalition, how are you getting students to vote now during this time? Because again, going back to campaigning, you no longer have college students on campuses. So not only am I with my Emerge hat on talking to our alums about how you have to create an entirely new field plan and calculate a new win number because you no longer have all of these students, all of these teachers in your district, but we're also talking to Catherine about, okay, these young people are home. How are you still engaging them during this time? We're talking to a lot of the Latino leaders about, you were doing a lot of work with immigration this election cycle, but now you have on the extra layer that ICE is still detaining people and COVID is running rampant during the detention centers and nothing is happening. So it really has become an opportunity to not only highlight these women and their work, but again, tell the stories of how women are responding to COVID and how even though our situation is so different, the work doesn't stop with politics. Like the work is needed now more than ever. So to have the opportunity to amplify the work that they're doing via the BGG is wonderful, but also with Emerge to again highlight this is why we need more women in politics. This is why we need more women in leadership. And during our training, our communications piece really talks about telling your story, who you are, why you're doing what you're doing, why you want to run for office. And now during this time, we're actually seeing that is the best way for us to connect with people during this time.
I think a lot of people, whether it's in their corporate communications or their family and friends, people are really focusing on communicating differently, telling their stories differently. And also, a lot of people are taking time to be creative and think about just using different mediums. I think my just personal understanding is a lot of that is transitioning into podcasts. So, Janine, I'm wondering whether you've seen growth in the number of podcasts on Simplecast, and with so many shows out there, with I think 1 million podcasts out there, how do you see people break through? How do you get attention, especially now, perhaps when there is more noise than ever?
Yeah. I mean, taking that in two parts and addressing your first question first, I actually just wrote an article that came out earlier this week about how I think this is podcasting's opportunity. It's this pandemic. I mean, really on our platform, we're seeing that creators are creating. This last month, we had 3 times as many people start podcasts on our platform as we did just in December, so just 3 months earlier. And I think it's because, like Shanti was saying, that there's different sectors that had the rug pulled out from under them, where it's no longer feasible for events teams, for politicians to do live campaign rallies, for companies to do in-person all hands or offsite things. So all of these different organizations that are looking at different ways to try and communicate with people, and they're looking for something that's not just the Zoom meeting, right? And so they're turning to podcasting to do that. We're also seeing that listeners are listening. I think immediately we saw there was some, I think, confusion in the numbers that came out about, we're seeing these big declines in listenership. Mm-hmm. I think we did see some transitions over the immediate 2 weeks following mid-March. When we saw behavior shift from commutes and people switching to maybe listening to news more than their good old-fashioned social kind of podcasts that they were traditionally listening to. And we've started to see all of that kind of rebound back to normal levels. We also saw a number of creators who totally understandably took a break in their regular cycle of podcasting during that time. So we saw some listenership contribution numbers as related to that. But this month we're seeing listenership totally rebounding. We're seeing, advertisers advertising. I think we'll see even more of that as people start to look to try and make their budget as efficient as possible and realize that podcasting is the best kept secret in the advertising industry, because you get great connection with your audience. You can really target the audience that you want to connect with, and do it at a much more reasonable spin than TV or, God forbid, nobody's doing billboard and outdoor right now. Right? So you can spend differently. with advertising. And then, like you were saying, Jenny, and like what you're seeing there at Wonder Media Network, organizations are trying to figure out something new. And I don't think that they're going to turn back, because once people can discover podcasting, we see that the data is that they love the medium. They like how they're able to build it into their daily routine. They love that it's not in front of a screen and that it's accessible, and they don't turn back. So I think we will start to see all of those trends continue, and that you'll only see the growth curve of podcasting increasing over the next couple of months. And then, I mean, to your second point of like, how do you break through the noise? That it's true, there's 1 million podcasts now, which is crazy. I think that the fundamental question is, who is the audience that you're trying to target, and how can you develop for that audience? So the mistake that I see a lot of people make is to just create something and then expect the audience to come without really thinking about who that person is that they're speaking to and how they're going to get them to listen to them. And a lot of creators just want to do the creative part of it, and they don't want to do the marketing part of it. And if that's not going to be you, if that's not your bag, you need to have a plan for what that's going to look like. Otherwise, you're going to be disappointed if you're just trying to target like a Gen Pop audience, and just because you built it, they didn't come.
Totally. We talk a lot about that, because if we're trying to amplify underrepresented voices, we're not doing our job if no one's listening, because then it's sort of shouting into a void. So we spend a lot of time thinking about, how to actually acquire those listeners. And I think interestingly to your point about people being excited about the medium, we're getting that feedback from listeners of our Wonder Media Network shows that are wherever you listen, and also from companies we're working with on internal and external pods there, where people are excited to have something else that isn't just a conference call over video these days, because we're all spending a lot of time on screen that way. Yeah. I'd love to circle back and just find out a little bit more, like, why were each of you interested in podcasting as a medium to begin with? So I'd love to rewind there and talk about that, and then maybe how you think the value of audio has shifted from then to now. Maybe Ashanti, do you want to start?
Yes. So I think Jenny knows this story, because obviously the podcast is on Wonder Media Network. But what was the catalyst for wanting to create the podcast was on our blog. We did a series called Being the Only Brown Girl in the Room, where several of our contributors talked about just the different experiences when you're the only woman, especially when you're the only woman of color, and just really the stress, the insensitivity, the sexism, the racism, the misogyny that you face. And it was just really well received by all of the people who love the BGG, but they kept saying, like, we want more. We want for you to, like, really talk about your experiences. We want to hear you. And I was like, okay, don't know what that looks like. But then I realized, oh, Jenny, Wonder Media Network, I've been appearing on all these podcasts. So I drafted up an email to Jenny where it actually took me a few days to send it, where I wanted to ask her, like, do you even think the BGG could be a podcast? Would there be any interest in this? And I was like, do I hit send? Oh, she's going to think I'm so silly. Like, why would this even be a podcast? But like, I closed my eyes, hit send, and like literally 1 minute later, I was like, yes, absolutely, let's talk. And she really helped us bring the BGG podcast to what it is. And then just continuing to do like my research in the podcasting space. It was just another medium where you did not have a lot of voices of women of color, especially when it came to politics. So to really know that teaming up with Wonder Media Network, that we were going to be able to bring the BGG, but also the experiences, the knowledge of being women of color in politics to more women, that was really important to me. But it was also important for the BGG that we are living our values, which is why I love that we're on Wonder Media Network because it is all women. And I love that I get to say that about our podcast and being really true and authentic to who we are. And the feedback that I get, it makes you realize just in so many of these states and so many of these cities, it was just like my experience when I was a young brown girl interested in politics. I didn't see a lot of people who looked like me. I didn't know if I could even do this. So when I get the emails and you see the tweets from women who are like, okay, this is letting me know that I can do this because they still don't see this where they're at. They don't have the opportunities that I now have being in DC, where I can go to a panel full of women of color or go to these conferences, but to be able to bring that to them and let them know that there is a place for you, in this world. That's really what the podcast is doing, and know that there are other women out there who are experiencing the exact same thing. And do we all have it figured out? No, we don't pretend to be perfect, but we're figuring it out together. And I see someone in the chat. Yes. So the BGG is the Brown Girls Guide to Politics. We call it the BGG for short. So for me, that's really what made me want to bring this into the podcast format, is to be able to reach more women of color, especially young brown girls, and let them know that, yes, there is room, there is space for you in this political world, and there's women that want to help you survive and thrive in it.
How about you? How did you get into podcasting, and how do you feel like perhaps the value has changed or not over time?
So I've been obsessed with podcasts since college, and the first show that I really fell in love with was Radiolab, which just is so wonderful till this day. I was having something of a quarter-life existential crisis about what my purpose on this planet could be, and trying to figure out what I wanted to do next in life. And one of the issues that we have as young Arabs is that mainstream media in the Middle East doesn't speak to us; it speaks to our parents. And most media typically has an agenda. And that's why you see such a huge uptake in things like social media and YouTube. We have some of the highest, we top global usage worldwide for Facebook, Snapchat, and YouTube. But I loved podcasts, and so I wanted to tell stories in that format. And I didn't have a background in media starting, so it was a very steep learning curve, I would say. But alhamdulillah, we have an amazing team of storytellers, and I'm really proud of the stories that we put out. And on a daily basis, we get messages from listeners saying that they're crying listening to our stories, or we have a show called Jasadi, which is about our relationship with our bodies. And one girl messaged recently to say that listening to Jasadi made her love herself a little bit more, which is just such an extraordinary thing to hear. And that's why we're doing this. I think in terms of the value proposition, so again, to give a little bit of context, when we started with our first show, there was maybe 50 podcasts coming out of the Middle East, and we're a population of 350 million across the region, 140 million of which are between the ages of 15 and 35. So it's very, very young people. And storytelling, as you said, Jenny, is how we understand each other a little bit more. And I think telling the kinds of stories in which we can actually see ourselves is so important on so many levels. And so I think the value proposition of podcasting has just grown, because it is this space where you can be an independent media maker, and the barrier to end is quite low, and it's a space you can carve out, and with the kind of intention that we put behind our story, the episode is beautiful.
Wow, to get that sort of listener feedback is amazing. I spoke with we got a message from a young girl the other day who said that she was inspired by one of our shows, Encyclopedia Womanica, to create her own show, and now she's like 8 years old and is doing her own podcast, and it made my
That's amazing.
So I love that you mentioned that. Janine, how about you? How'd you get into the podcast world?
Well, I'll tell you that, but first I want to tell you that my Encyclopedia Womanica I had been listening to in the car with my kids on the way to school. I have two boys. And, you know, they didn't realize that it was all about women. And so one day my one son says, are there any like men scientists that are famous? And I'm like, I don't know. We're just going to have to keep listening and see if we hear about it. I was like, wow. Yes, I skewed them.
Wow, what an amazing reversal of
like. I don't know. There might be. We talk a lot about like what was our gateway podcast that got us into listening, and mine is one that nobody's ever heard of. I was an entertainment lawyer by background and decided that I was done with big law life and accepted a position as the general counsel of a company called Media Temple, which is like hardcore tech. And they had, I think we were 215 employees, and there was like 195 of them were men and 20 were women. And it was like very like internet infrastructure. And I would go into these meetings, like these executive committee meetings or meetings with engineers, and I just had no idea what they were talking about. And I got an incredible amount of imposter syndrome. What did I do? I'm not going to be able to contribute to this organization. It's not like I can go back to school now and become an engineer, or like, how do you navigate the world to try and figure out like the internet infrastructure? And so I found this podcast called the Cloud Computing Podcast. And it was like, I realized it was like this super tool that was that nobody had told me about, like that I could listen to this while I was working out. I could listen to this while I was, you know, putting the kids to bed. I could listen to it like just all of these different times. And it helped me just like absorb like a sponge the words that they were talking about and the meanings. And it really made me feel like I deserved like a seat at that table in that room. And it was that empowering to me that I was like, oh, I just love podcasting. And since then I've just been like this huge evangelist. And then I guess it was like 6 or 7 years ago that Brad, our CEO, came to me and said, I'm going to start a podcasting technology company because I think that podcasting tools suck and they haven't been updated since like 1995 and I know how to fix it. And I was like, well, you know, I trust you and I like podcasts. So I wrote Brad his very first check, and I was the first investor in Simplecast. And I kind of stood by the side and did what I could to help them until I came to join the team 2 years ago. So now whenever I need to learn about anything, the first thing I do is like, oh, there's got to be a podcast on this.
Wow, that is definitely the most unique gateway podcast I feel like I've ever heard. I'm like embarrassed to say, I feel like my gateway podcast was like Serial, which is perhaps the least unique gateway podcast to possibly mention. So how do you think that the podcast industry is doing in terms of representing women and people of color and diverse voices and stories broadly? What's sort of your temperature check on that? And what do you think we could be doing better? And whoever wants to launch can take this one.
I mean, I can start and tell you a little bit about what we think the numbers show. So I've been doing a lot of research in this space. I mean, so on the one hand, we've seen a lot of really successful women creators, women producers, who've championed voices like the voices in Serial. A lot of networks, women seem to be very well regarded professionally in the podcasting space. Yet when we do the surveys and we look at the numbers, we're already seeing a wage gap in podcasting, which is really disappointing. We're seeing behaviors that women take in podcasting, whether that's being imposed upon them or whether it's self-imposed. So for example, like women are much less likely to ask people to support them in their podcasts than men are. We partnered with the folks over at Glow, which is like a crowdfunding kind of platform, and looked at some of their numbers. So even though men and women tend to like start accounts in equal numbers, we definitely see that women are much less likely to launch on Glow to actually go out and get money. Like some of the data was showing that it was only 1 in 4 women who were launching to their campaign to seek sponsorships. We see, when we look at kind of the media and the coverage that women podcasters get, we see it's definitely less than the male podcasters, which is disappointing. Like, even on the listicles, you're much more likely to be listed in a listicle as a male host than you are as a female host. And so just kind of the traditional baggage that we've seen in media, even though we're new age and there's so many powerful women voices here, we see the same kind of baggage being carried over into podcasting. And I think we need to proactively figure out how to make it so that it's not going to happen to this medium.
It's really depressing. And
yeah, those are really depressing statistics, Janine. Thank you for that.
The key to change is recognizing that you have a problem, right?
Yeah.
True. And I do think like the best, as we talked about, like there's so many shows out there, you have to figure out ways to get through the noise. And some of the best ways are to be noticed on those kinds of things like listicles and things like that. Yeah. And often the best luck we've had on that has been through like Women's History Month, where it's like, we have to be on there. So I don't know. What do you think, Heba?
I don't have as much visibility within the US podcasting market, but I can tell you in the Middle East. So we're really small as a landscape. There's probably 1,500 active podcasts, either in Arabic or in English, coming out of the region, but it's growing like exponentially. Like every week there's, a dozen more that are launching. And I will say, so we're one of a few players who are looking at the space from a commercial perspective. We're one of actually only 12 podcast companies in the region. We're the first venture-backed and only venture-backed podcast company in the Middle East. So the fact that we're run by women, I think, is a really, really beautiful signal for the industry. But I will say that looking around at the other commercially focused shows and just the shows in general is that there's definitely a lot of men, which I don't think I realized until you brought this question up, Jenny. Like even when we have a regional podcast forum, and most of the people on the panel are men, which is sad because I help organize that. So I should pay more attention to those things. But I think it does speak to, I think it's most podcasters in the region are male. Yeah,
that's really interesting. It would make sense that if it's happening here, it's happening everywhere. And I think it'll be interesting to see like how if and how that can shift over time, if it's possible to make it better, or if it will go the same way as other sort of parts of the media industry as podcasting continues to grow.
We definitely need to recruit allies who are men and who are also leaders in this space. And, just this weekend, I saw somebody post something in one of the most popular social groups online for podcast creators and said, that their advice was that women podcast anonymously because guys are creepy, right? And it's like, it's so disappointing to reinforce a fear that maybe some women already have coming into the space, or that kind of old world thinking that it's women's responsibility to protect themselves from creepy guys. So it's we need allies across the industry to help us make sure that that our industry doesn't go this way.
Yeah, and especially allies at some of the biggest like listening platforms where they can help boost shows in a way that can really attract new listeners. Feels like that's
definitely. Yeah, it's as we look at the data on how people's audiences grow, the people who a lot of people talk about like slow and steady growth, like getting this gradual hill, but our data shows that the people whose overall audiences grow faster are actually the people who have stair steps on their growth curve. And what it really means is that those people are out there like getting a big episode out or getting some big promo behind it or getting a big guest, right? And they're doing that every once in a while, and they're getting that pop of those new listeners, and those new listeners are sticking around and telling their friends about it. And so those promoting and figuring out how to really effectively market and co-promote, I mean, it's a big driver of success if you're measuring success in terms of overall audience.
Wow. Ashanti, I don't want to skip without giving you a chance to add. Is there anything you want to add right now?
You know, I have so much to say when it comes to subjects like this, but I think I will hit two main points. Again, it goes back to why I talked about Wonder Media Network is so important, because I think if Wonder Media Network didn't exist, there wouldn't be a Brown Girls Guide to Politics podcast, because it is the fact that you are about uplifting the voices of other women. And people ask me all the time, like, how did you just come out with this great podcast and you're topping like iTunes and being featured? I'm like, I don't know, it's Jenny and her team. Wow. You know, they do all of these things and people are asking me questions. I'm like, I record and I send it and we listen and we do all these things. But I am like very honest that if Wonder Media Network didn't exist, like I would not be where I was at with the podcast, and we wouldn't be able to tell these stories. So that's why it's just important to even have women like Jenny, women like all of you who are doing what you do, because it just goes back to the women who do lift up other women and realize how important it is to have our voices in this space. And then if I even put on the hat of doing it, like as a Black woman, there's still not a lot of us. When you just think about Black, Brown, Indigenous women, there's still not a lot of us. But we do see more of them getting involved in podcasting, which is great. And I know that's true because they email Wonder Media Network and want to come on the BGG, but that's exciting to me because that means, oh, someone else is starting a podcast and they want to come on our podcast, you know, to advertise their podcast. But those are the things that we want to do because we are able to have that platform, and we do want to give them that platform too. And going back to what Janine was saying with the guy with the creepy comment, like that doesn't surprise me at all, because even doing this, I still get the crazy emails, you know, people who leave the negative reviews. Even when I put my Emerge hat on all the time, I get men who email me and tell me we're doing this all wrong because I need to teach women how to run from the perspective of a man if they want to win. To which I'm like, we train 4,000 women, 800 of them are currently in office, so I think we're doing just fine with our program. But it is also how are men uplifting women in this space too. Just thinking about the podcast that I've been on to promote the BGG, only 2 men have invited me on their podcast, and we're in season 3. So just think about that. So as men, how are you also using your voice to amplify women as well? Because that is important too. And I'm all about parity in everything that I do, because I just wake up every day and think about women. So just like I want to see parity of women in elected office, you know, I would love to see parity for women in this space as well, because it is so important. And when Jenny was telling me the story of like the story of the 8-year-old girl, like that is why this matters. That is why the voices of women matter, because especially for young girls at that age, that is when they're either going to develop great confidence or lower confidence. So if our work is going to help them build better confidence, that is just a really great reason to have more women in podcasting.
Ashanti, I need to like record you just saying all of that as a pump up speech for me.
I was like statistics, and she came in and was like, "Yeah." I was like,
I know. I'm like, okay, I gotta go. I'm pumped up now.
I only speak the truth.
Thank you. These are extraordinary times for many reasons, and I think we're all having to deal with working differently and living differently and imagining a future that feels very uncertain in lots of ways. And I'm wondering how you're thinking about that affecting your business, your work, and how perhaps you're inventing or creating new products, projects, or channels of engagement to interact with your audience or customers or the people who you care about. How are you thinking about things differently? Janine, maybe we'll start with you this time.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the podcasting space is really exciting, ripe with opportunity. We're seeing even internally some of the things that are changing. It's funny because we've always been a virtual organization. Everybody has worked from home. And so we've had a lot of people reaching out to talk to us about like, how are you effectively doing this? Because so many people had kind of that Band-Aid ripped and found themselves in a virtual organization and don't know how to have camaraderie, or they're having lots of weird miscommunication issues. And those are all things that we had to figure out as an organization early on. And, you know, talking about, I find myself talking to people a lot right now about how to effectively lead a remote organization, whether that's in the podcasting space or not. And encouraging people to think of podcasting first when they do that. You know, we actually did speaking of Radio Lab, we did an interesting workplace harassment training not too long ago where everybody listened to the Radio Lab series In the Know. And then we gathered together to talk about, you know, how that impacted all of us and what did we think and feel, and just thinking about leveraging audio for kind of every aspect of working together as a team. That's been an area where we've been really creative, and it's been fun to engage publicly on in light of the changes recently.
Wow. We've been talking a lot and are working on those kinds of sort of audio trainings. And it's interesting how what we've found and heard is that it's easier to listen to those things when you're not perhaps watching like the tacky videos that are sometimes accompanying training, big corporate trainings. That's really interesting. How about you?
Similar to Janine. So we're a virtual company as well. So from that perspective, that was easy for us. But from how we've kind of rethought how to engage with our audience, we started to do Instagram. We do this thing called a podcast club every week on Instagram, where a producer will sit down with a guest and have a conversation, maybe expound upon an episode or maybe a different conversation. And those have been received really well. Those have been quite lovely. We've also come up with some, I mean, obviously it's a lot harder to do interviews now, and for guests who will permit it, we'll send them like easy to use recorders so they can self-tape sync, but a lot of guests don't feel comfortable receiving packages. And so we've had to rethink quite a few episodes and some shows that we have in the pipeline. And so we're thinking about one right now where we would send recorders and have people interview their families and kind of crowdsource stories that way, which I think would be really, really lovely. And we've done a couple of episodes where we've invited our audience to send in voice notes. So just about 2 weeks into the lockdown, we did a couple of special episodes that were just, we called them Lockdown Diaries, which was such an awesome, I think one of the most powerful things about our team and about our audience is that we are really, we have listeners from all across the region. And so you get this montage of voices from Libya and from Syria and from Palestine and from Dubai. I think that kind of sense of community is just incredible. And that wouldn't have happened really, I think, were it not like a time like this. You know, I don't think we would have had such engagement from listeners to send in voice notes. So yeah, I think we've rethought a couple of things, but who knows? I don't know. Ask again in a couple of weeks if we're still in this. We might resort to Zoom call. I don't know.
Yeah, figuring out how to rejigger recordings was an interesting challenge. I think that we had to sort of suss out with different shows like what could continue on as planned and what would have to be shifted a bit. For sure. Ashanti, how about you?
Oh, I think the biggest thing was, and Jenny and I were talking about this before we started, was with season 2, we really wanted to we started doing all these live events. And then that was something that we couldn't do anymore. So we literally had to go back to the drawing board with season 3, which looks a lot like season 1, which is fine, with really doing the interviews, but still really figuring out, okay, how are we drawing in the audience to make it more interactive? So really moving forward is, how can we incorporate some Instagram lives with the podcast? How can we incorporate, some Facebook, some Twitter? So really amping up our social media around how we're promoting the podcast and how we're still really wanting to bring the listeners in on the experience, because that's something that I always strive for with the BGG. Is I want for the listeners to feel that they're in the room, that they're a part of the conversation, that they're just sitting around, or they're in the car or on the subway when it's safe again, just listening to some girlfriends having that conversation. So with this season, it was really, okay, how do we bring that back in? And surprisingly, a lot of it was the COVID conversation, really starting with that question, how are you during this time? Like, no, really, how are you? Let's not, say like, oh, I'm fine, things are good, and bring that rawness and that realness. And that's the biggest feedback that I'm actually getting from people this season is, it's so nice to hear all these accomplished women talking about, yeah, this homeschooling, I don't know about it, things are, really not that fabulous, but they're still trucking along. So just that point that we are all in this together. So that's how we really adapted this season, is by not ignoring the fact that things are different. We're in different times, and having the conversation about that, as well as how are you going to change the world in November?
Totally. Yeah, we produced the second season of Women Belong in the House, which was how Ashanti and I first met. And the first episode launched March 12th, and it was an 8-episode season. So like when we started production, COVID was just not something that we thought we had no idea it was going to turn into what it was. And it ended up being such a constant theme throughout many of the conversations we had and much of the season, because you can't really talk about the whole season about women who are serving in the House of Representatives. You can't really talk about that without obviously changing a bit as the world has changed so significantly. I want to make sure that we leave time for people's questions. So this is just a quick reminder. If you're watching and you have any questions, feel free to submit them. And if you have already asked them, I'll get to them. Before we do that, as people are maybe submitting questions, if they have them, I find whenever I'm on panels that I often leave wishing with something that I wanted to say that the person didn't ask me about. So my final question is, what have I not asked you about? Maybe it's something you're excited about or something that you're upset about, but what have I missed that you wish I had asked? How about let's start with you?
No, I think we should start with Ashanti.
I mean, we can.
And, I think it was actually one of the questions that popped up in the chat box is, what are some of the challenges of this work? And I think that's always really important. And again, I'm always fully honest. I came into this not knowing anything about podcasting. When it even first popped into my mind, this is something the BGG could do. Before I emailed Jenny, I literally Googled, how do you start a podcast? I'm like, I don't know anything about this. And it was the same way that I started the BGG in general. I was like, how do you start a blog? So for me, it's always admitting, know what you don't know. And I did not know a lot. And again, that's why I'm very fortunate that I had Jenny to teach me all of this, because podcasting, apparently this is the creative space. That's what the BGG attorney tells me. I'm a creative now. This was something that I did not know anything about, and just being able to really learn from people. And that's why I think it's just always so important to share, you know, what is good, what's great, and what is not great. Because that's why I always like to share that, because that's how I learn from people who are willing to share that. So I think one of the biggest struggles was, I'm entering a space I don't know anything about. I'm going to mess up. Like, things aren't always going to be lovely and perfect. And that's okay, because I'll learn and I'll get better. I remember the first episode we recorded, I actually recorded it like it was a radio interview. And afterwards, Jenny was like, you can breathe, you can take breaks, like we can edit the conversation, because I had only done like radio before. So that was what I was bringing into this, is like, oh, I have to conduct this like a radio interview, and I practiced my questions. And then Jenny was like, no. So, but that was really good, because when we did do our first roundtable event, we recorded it in a hotel conference room, and some of the staff didn't know we were in there, and they like were literally bringing in stuff to like set up for another event. And I just paused and was like, hey, you know, wrong room. And they're like, oh, sorry. But it was great that I knew to pause, because we could edit this out. Otherwise, I would have freaked out. And I actually really looked smart, because our guests were looking at me, and I got to say, oh, it's podcasting. We just get to edit it. It's fine. Everything's fine. But I knew that from learning from past experiences.
Yeah, I'm going to piggyback off of that and say that I think the thing that everybody should be doing more of is to solicit information and share information. Right. So one of the biggest, I think, anxiety-inducing things about podcasting is that because it's a new medium, and because it's really hard to find like standards in the space, like people have access to their own numbers, but don't necessarily have any sense of like what is normal. And is this good? How am I supposed to do this? Like, is this a normal growth trajectory? Or like, should I also be on Spotify? Like, kind of these like base questions that a lot of times we see people are too reticent to ask. And I think that especially on the women's side, and addressing things like the accessibility gap and the wage gap, like if we were more proactive in sharing, like, hey, you know, here's this offer that I got from this advertiser. Does this seem normal to you? Or like, what does a media kit look like? Can you send me your media kit? Like, just share your numbers more, share your insights more. Like, there's no, we are certainly not even approaching the edge of the petri dish in podcasting. So there should be no fear of competition. There's plenty of room for everybody. And just, you know, like, get out there and serve each other like a community, and all ships will rise.
Yeah, we've been saved from some pretty horrible deals because of transparency. And so I know if anyone ever wants to talk, I'm very happy to help or to talk through whatever, because I feel like we need to all pay it forward. All right, have a nice.
I don't have any genius to add. I think both of what you said, I completely agree. And it's forums like this that are really, really powerful. It's really nice to come together as women and talk about our experiences within this space. I think that's awesome. And just more of this. This is great.
Great. Well, we'll keep it going. Okay, we're gonna run through some of these questions and see what we can get. Okay, number one. First of all, it's Encyclopedia Womanica. Check it out wherever you listen. Every episode is about a different woman from history.
I saw that question, but I appreciate. No, I'm just kidding.
You may not know about, but should. But I do think that Encyclopedia Romantica is an incredible title, and maybe should be for later use. So thank you.
There is ripe room in romance for podcasting, for sure.
Truly. Shay asked, what are the best platforms for podcasts?
What do you mean in terms of platforms? So, I mean, there are the places that people listen. I think there are a lot of really great opportunities for listeners to discover you. A lot of it depends on kind of what the tech is that the listener is comfortable with, and whether you're going to be able to convince them to listen on a different app. if your goal is to just grow your audience as big as possible, then my advice would be to get on as many listening platforms as possible and make it easy for people to discover you wherever they are. I think one thing that people tend to forget, like on a tips and tricks, is how many people are actually listening from the web, and that you do need to have a web presence. You need to have a website. You need to have a website that's optimized for podcast discoverability. You need to have embeddable players that you can share everywhere so that people can find and listen to your podcast really easily. A lot of people sample podcasts on the web before they like find the ones that they love and then subscribe to them on their podcast app of choice. So those are, I think, in terms of the listening platforms. In terms of the distribution platforms, like a platform like Simplecast, you only need to pick one. So pick the one that you like and that's easy to use, and that has like a plan that fits right for you. But you want to find one that will give you the most flexibility for what it is that you want to do. How many listeners, how many listens you want to get, how many episodes you want to have, how many different kinds of podcasts you want to make, how you want to collaborate as a team. So the different podcast tech companies in the space serve a little bit different sectors of the market. So I think Simplecast is the best, but pick one that's the right fit for you.
I also think that Simplecast is the best. Okay, we're gonna, as I'm running through, some of these, it seems like were already answered. If people, please share Shay also asked, please share your mistakes while producing a podcast and tips or hacks for starting a podcast.
I have one that I want to, but then I'm going to let talk. So one thing that we notice about like the way that men buy and the way that men create versus the way that women buy and women create is that the buy cycle for women tends to be a lot longer than it is for men. And that when women launch their podcast, they tend to launch with fewer episodes that are almost like perfectly curated, right? That there's like a lot of thinking that goes into like, I want to get this perfect and get this out there. And it takes a long time to get this podcast out there. And we always say a strong suggestion is that you launch with at least 2 episodes and a trailer, because it helps with growing your audience at the beginning. And that the people who tend to like just kind of get out there and start trying it get good quicker. So to try and get over that like early anxiety you have about like, oh, I want this thing to be perfect because somebody that I know is going to hear it, like try and get over that, just like make something, start getting it out there and start getting good at it. And it will come much more naturally and your audience will grow more quickly if you do it that way.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. That was, I think, one of the lessons from our early days as well. And I'll say that, like when I listened to our first episodes, I cringe by how bad I think they are in comparison to where we've gotten. But we had to produce that and put that out there to learn. And then also, it's actually how everyone on our team found us, is because we put something out there, and then other people were like, "Oh, I want to be a part of that," which is really powerful. The other thing from starting a show is to make sure that you have enough of a buffer, like figure out how long it takes you to produce one episode, and then plan based on whatever you want your release schedule to be like. We've experimented with a couple of different kinds of release cadences. I would say monthly is a terrible idea. Don't do that. At least have an episode out every 2 weeks, if not once a week, if not more. Like if you could. Some shows do really well with daily podcasts. That's a huge lift, and I think they're superhuman. But know how long it takes you to produce one episode, how frequently you want to release the episodes, to make sure you have a buffer between when you'll finish, when you'll release all the episodes that you've produced and the new one that you're working on. For us, when we started, we launched 4 episodes and then went silent for 6 months, because that's how long it took us to make the next episodes. Just manage your time with that. And last thing that I'll say is your listeners for audio quality in their reviews, especially if the content is really good. And so there's really need. I think beautiful things about it's very, very accessible, and there's a barrier where you have to buy all this really expensive recording gear. You can just start with something simple, learn how to get really good at producing piece, and then you can upgrade your equipment, get better with audio, and by still record in our closets. So it's fan video thing like that. But listen, tell, and I actually think they find it endearing whenever we post photos under a blanket.
Yeah, we've reverted back to recording like in closets because we have evolved out of that, but we're back. And it's
Bernard Glass is recording in his closet, so if he can do it, everybody can.
Yeah, it's kind of great. And also I completely second everything that you, or third, all of the things that have been said. Especially like the buffer. It's very important to have buffer time and to have, if possible, to have multiple episodes finished before you launch, or you're just going to be playing catch up forever. And that's horrible. Ashanti, is there anything you want to add?
I think for me, like tips wise, I really listen to every episode and I take notes on like what I liked that I did and what I didn't do, and definitely use that to grow. And then I also do incorporate the feedback that I get from the listeners about what they like. When I used to attend a lot of conferences, there were people that would come up and tell me what they liked about their favorite episode, how it made them feel. And, you know, after they walked away, I would like take out my phone and record a little voice note, because I also didn't want to seem like a weirdo doing it in front of them. So I would remember the things that they like. And so I would incorporate that too into future episodes and seasons. So I think definitely do that hard critique of you, and then incorporate what your listeners are telling you that they like as well. Amazing.
Well, our time is up, which is sad because I've so enjoyed all of this, and I hope that it's been really useful for people who are watching. I would love to be a resource for any and everyone watching. You can email me at jenny@wondermedianetwork.com. And hopefully we can continue the conversation. It was just great speaking with all of you. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks for everyone putting this together.